Good evening. Welcome back to Northern Maine Productions. Welcome to my basement. About a year or so ago, I did a video series on the Homestead Resurrection here at my old homestead. I'm actually in the basement of the house that I grew up in. I was not too happy with those videos. The quality of them was bad. Overall, they were not well put together, so I took them down. As you can guess, living here in a 92-year-old house has proved to test my patience and my abilities as far as getting this place a little bit up to date. This old house was still operating on its original wiring system from 1927 when I moved back here in 2014. I'm sorry if my voice cracks up on you some. I'm just recently recovering from COVID, so bear with me. What I have here is I have some things here to show you guys. I have old forms of wiring and other devices that were used in this place over the years, and I kept some of them. I thought that I would show some of the stuff to you, and I also have a few older things that I've collected that were made before this house was built, and I'll show those to you too. If you can see this beam up in here and behind me, you can see these little nail holes. That is where little porcelain insulators used to hang. I'll put a pause here, and I'll put up a photograph of the original knob and tube wiring that was up here on this beam. Okay, well, as you can see, there was quite a rat's nest of wiring up there on this beam here. This is one of the main carrying beams for the house. I'll bring a piece of this wiring over here. This was some of the original knob and tube wiring. Individual conductor. This is rubber cloth impregnated wire, and as you can see, that is a number 10 copper strand. That's a solid strand wire. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this wire. It was okay, I mean, other than the fact that it was an ungrounded system. The problem was with this is when people started doing upgrades to this system over the years, and this is one of the literally hundreds of splices that used to be in this house. This is actually an original splice from the knob and tube wiring here. This is how they put this stuff together back in 1927 or 28. Now there's sufficient wrapping on there, you know, the wire is wrapped around there tightly. However, they failed to put any solder on those joints, and it was this way all through this house. I took some of the stuff out of the walls upstairs, and there was just dozens and dozens of splices in this wire all through the house, and that's how it was. And that's not good because, you know, over years of heating and contracting and cooling off, you know, heating up and cooling off and expansion, contraction, these joints will loosen up. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but I'm actually wiggling that. That's loose. This was wrapped up in old cloth friction tape originally. I think I have some of that stuff here somewhere. That right there is an example of how they did this. That's original old friction tape. So that's where the problem lied with knob and tube wiring. It just, oftentimes the connections to it were really crappy. Of course, originally this house did not have any electrical outlets, wall receptacles in it. It mainly just had 2 circuits of lighting. Of course, over the years, coming into the 1930s and the 1940s, appliances and televisions and toasters and Christmas lights and things like that, you know, radio sets, so that stuff was all coming into vogue. Became really popular, and people had to upgrade these older houses with early installations in them because they didn't have any receptacles to plug in anything. So that was one of the issues with this house. There were multiples of outlets and added on devices spliced into that old knob and tube system that was up here, which itself wasn't nearly as bad as the fact that that whole entire circuit that ran the 25 feet of this beam was one circuit, and it powered more than half of the house. I looked it up on my old schematic the other day, and I believe that there was 8 light fixtures and I think 9 receptacles spliced onto that, in addition to the water pump you see over there in the corner. That was hooked up to it. And let me see what else was on there. I think that was about it. But you know, that circuit, and when I show you the next article here, you're gonna be amazed that this house is even still standing. Okay. Now keep in mind, when my mom and dad lived here over 20 years ago, this house had a 60 amp service entrance panel on it. It had 2x4 60 amp box. It had a main disconnect and a range disconnect, and it had 4 circuit fuses, and I think there was two of these boxes like this spliced on there. One of them ran the hot water heater and the other one ran the electric dryer. What I'm going to show you here, at some point in time, I believe they upgraded the service panel from 30 amps to 60 amps here. This house only had 2 circuits in it originally. There was only 2 circuits of knob and tube wiring. The rest of it was all added on later on. But this piece of wire right here, you know, if you look at this, this is a pretty significant looking cable. It's thick and it's heavy. It's got a cloth jacket on it. The problem with it is that, yes, that's correct. That entire knob and tube circuit was powered by a 14 gauge feeder cable from probably in the 1940s, I would guess. Of course, these are no different than the knob and tube wiring that ran the light fixtures upstairs. This has got rubber impregnated, or rubber vulcanizing on these old wires, and it's covered in this cotton braid. The stuff's quite flammable. I think I can show you right here, right now. You see, stuff burns readily. So if you look closely at some of these wires, though, they've got a distinct bluish purple tint to them, indicating to me that they have been really hot several times. When I actually took this down and bent this for the first time, it really it cracked quite loudly. But this is an example of some of the wiring that was up in the ceilings of this house that ran the light fixtures. And this is pretty much an example of how bad it looked under the light fixtures. That is an old knob and tube light fixture box. Believe it or not, there was actually one in this house. There weren't many, but that one has even got a nipple in the center of it to be used when you converted gas lighting fixtures to electric. This is actually made so that the gas tubing from your old light fixture from way back when could screw onto this, and it would hold up a gas lighting fixture. As you can see, that's a piece of protective loom that they installed to protect the wire where it went into a junction box. And they also use that on these old-fashioned, this is an old knob and tube switch box that I took out of this house, and they used it to put it into there too, to protect the wires from contacting the metal, because, you know, obviously there's no ground. So if a live wire happened to come in contact with this, the whole entire box or the light fixture or whatever would be live with power. Anyways, let's move on. So this is an early example of a light switch. This switch did not come from this house. I got this from a friend of mine. It came out of his old garage. This is a turn switch. As you can see, there's a little label there that says off and then on. That switch was made by, that's a Perkins switch. I would assume that probably still works. I've never put any power to it, but this would date from the very earliest days, probably from like around 1910. This is an example of an insulator that used to screw into the exterior of a building to transfer power from like this one was used to transfer power from house to the garage. And as you can see, there's still a porcelain tube on there that was used to protect the wires where they went through the beam. You know, the beams would be drilled, and these were set in there at a little bit of an angle so they wouldn't fall out. But this stuff here is really bad shape because it endured many years of being outside in the weather. Let's see here. So we'll move up to, you know, later on in the 1930s and 40s, manufacturers started getting a little bit better at creating newer methods of wire. This is what they called Greenfield or BX cable. It's just a steel or aluminized or galvanized jacket. This is the wiring that was inside of that. As you can see, that's got like a paper wrap on it. However, once you get beyond the paper wrap, you'll find that that's just same wire as knob and tube wiring. 14 gauge, rubber impregnated with a cloth cotton wrapping on it. This one is pretty badly deteriorated, as you can see. Another thing that you would notice that this wire is actually covered. This is actually tinned wire. It's actually copper wire, but it's got a tin coating on it that protected the copper from the chemicals in the vulcanized rubber. I guess that had a tendency to corrode the wire, corrode copper. And of course the tin coating on the copper lended itself to soldering too. This stuff was pretty good. The problem is where it came out around these sharp edges of the cabling. It had a tendency to cut, you know, it had a tendency to cut this cloth jacket, and it would get frayed, and sometimes the stuff would short out. I've never been a very big fan of this stuff, you know, when it was used with this cloth wiring, because, you know, this stuff can short out, burn houses down too. Moving on, this is a piece of cabling that was found extensively in this house on most of the outlet circuit. This is the stuff that they spliced on to the knob and tube wiring that was up on that beam over there behind me. This is just NM. This is just NM cable. It's a 2-wire cable. I think they would call it, this one would have been NM 12-2 with no ground. There's no grounding provision in this wire. I actually left, there's still some of this stuff in this house that's active. All these lights in my basement here are powered by this type of wire. There's nothing really dangerous about this stuff, I guess. You know, this, especially the newer stuff from the middle to later 50s and early 60s, it had plastic wires on it. Some of the earliest stuff like this had an early form of a rubber coating on it that I guess used to deteriorate some. But one of the most interesting things that I found here was, I think that the 12 gauge conductors in this older cable is actually a bigger conductor than what's in a new wire. I have a piece of yellow wire. This is a 12-2 Romex wire. Look at the difference in the conductors there, if you can see the difference in them. Okay. This newer cable is definitely a little bit undersized compared to this. So I think this stuff here was probably excellent wire. It's just the jacket. You know, if you mishandled this stuff, it would get all frayed. And I think somebody got wound up in that one with a sawzall up in the wall when they were cutting out the outlet box, because it was like that when I took it out of there. Of course, they made that stuff also in that stuff they also made in 14-2. That's a piece of 14 gauge. This piece of wire here is actually in really good condition here. The jacket's even nice on it. You could use this again, I guess, for some little small project. This is an example of, you know, how the jacket will get frayed on that old wire too when you've mishandled it. This stuff's kind of cracked and rotten and broken. This is probably from the mid 1950s. This used to actually be hooked up to my furnace here. I only took this down about 2 years ago. This is example of an outlet that used to be in this house. That's an old T-slot receptacle from, you know, the 40s, 50s, early 60s. Sometime in the early 60s they started coming out with the ground receptacles. This is even an old 1950s or early 60s outside light. The wires are, I think the socket was replaced on this actually at some point, but as you can see, the mounting screws on this are made for one of the old 3-inch boxes. And I actually have this cover here that was made to go on a 3-inch box. As you can see, you could have easily mounted this light fixture right to a 3-inch box. This one was mounted to my grandparents' house and it never had a box in it. They just had a hole bored out through the side of the house and the wires were made up right inside the light fixture. So this cover that I just showed you was an example of what they would mount typically in a basement. They would mount a 3-inch box on a beam, and they would use a light fixture similar to this with a flex cord on it, and they would pass the flex cord into there, and of course you'd tie a knot into that and it would hold the light up like this, and then they'd wire it into the system and you'd have a hanging light fixture like that. Now obviously this one does not have the original cord on it. It's got a little piece of zip cord on it. This is an example of an old fuse box. This is a 30 amp 220 volt Westinghouse safety switch. There's date on this thing of October 14th 1938. This came out of my grandparents' house, and this used to power the water pump. As you can tell, it spent many years in a dirt basement with a dirt floor. This would have had a couple of 15 amp fuses originally. You would have had both legs of your, each leg of your 220 in here, and your ground's in the center. It's got a disconnect switch on it. One of the things that was kind of bad about fuses was the fact that these early Edison based fuses, now like that's a 15 amp fuse right there, you just seen me take it out of there. There's a 30 amp fuse from back in that same time period. Guess what? You screw right back in there and it would commence to burn up whatever was hooked up to that because it was overfused. The fuse would, you know, if you had something that only had a 12 or a 14 gauge wire hooked to this, you'd burn the wiring up before the fuse would blow. That was the only really bad thing with these old glass fuses. Later on they did make some adapters you could screw into here that would convert these into the newer type of fuses. But could this thing be used nowadays? I mean, it's pretty rusty, but it's not rotten. This part of it's in pretty good shape. The insulation don't look too bad. Probably most likely you could use this in a, you know, you could use this on an outdoor piece of equipment like a conveyor or something like that that had an electric motor on it. You could use this for a disconnect switch for an electric motor. As far as using this in a house, I probably wouldn't use this on anything inside of a house nowadays. Insurance companies won't allow it anyway, so you know, that's pretty much it. So there's another example of a porcelain tube that they used to use with knob and tube wiring. They would have actually drilled, like, pretend this is a stud. Well, let me see here. Let me go get a 2x4. Okay, so pretend this is your joist up in your ceiling. They would have drilled like a 1/2 inch hole through this, and it would have been at an angle. And they would have dropped this down through like that. That would have been so these wouldn't fall out, and you'd pass the wire through there. And that's how they pass the wires from stud to stud inside the walls. Of course, this is the knob portion of the knob and tube wiring. And what they would have done, they would have taken this piece of knob and tube wiring, and they would have, let me see if I can demonstrate this for you. Sorry for all the noise, but that's how they were installed originally. That's how they were done in this house anyways. But so that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to show you for the old equipment. There was, you know, this knob and tube switch box, obviously they have two separate small knockouts, and you can't put any of the new modern Romex connectors in these, so effectively that makes these boxes obsolete, which is too bad because they're a nice quality box. They're nice and strong, but this one I believe was used with this Greenfield cable originally, because that would have actually been able to go in there too. I think I showed this before when I had this box up here, but when they ran the knob and tube wires into these boxes, they of course would have fed the wire through this piece of loom, like, if I can get it to go through there. The wire's kind of bunged up on the end of it. Yeah, that's going through there too good. Okay, well, maybe I did get it to go through. Alright, so I did. So there's that piece of knob and tube wire, and then they would pass those into the box. And these would have been led off each way onto each wall stud. There was typically a board mounted between the studs that they mounted these boxes into. They'd cut a hole in the board to mount these, and then each wire, this wire would go off this way, and this one would go off towards me. But it was quite an art. And it was a labor-intensive art to put up knob and tube wire. And I actually, you can see that board, that display board that's back there. I actually put that together about 5 or 6 years ago out of some old stuff that was here in this house. And I'm going to tell you what, that was a big job just to do that little bit. It took a long time to put all that wire together and cut it all to the exact same length, cut it all to the exact right length. So what I'll show you here is I'll go along this beam here and show you how I upgraded stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the video off momentarily until I get the camera off the tripod, and then we'll come back. So bear with me here just for a minute. Alright, so we're back here, and I'm standing about the midway point of the house. This is about where that picture of the old knob and tube wiring was taken from. As you can see, I've put everything into junction boxes here. Wiring's firmly secured to the beam. I've installed a convenience outlet there, which rarely ever gets used. I'm actually using it for the first time in probably 2 or 3 years right now. But what I did was, I'll take you down this way. No, you see those bags back there. That actually isn't trash. That's actually returnables. So, no, it doesn't smell bad down here. This cable right here is actually a 12 gauge cable. I know it's white. This was actually some new old stock wire that I got from a friend of mine who was a retired electrician. He gave me a bunch of stuff here, so you'll see some odds and ends of different cables, but they are gauged appropriately. This is on a 20 amp circuit. This powers one of the outlets in my kitchen. And that right there, looking where those two wires go, goes up into the wall behind my refrigerator, and that is actually where that original knob and tube circuit passed up through, and it went to a 20 amp outlet that was behind the refrigerator. This circuit was powered off from one 20 amp fuse originally, and there was a whole array of different wire. You saw the knob and tube wiring. There was 12 and 14 gauge wiring hooked to this, including the whole second floor lighting system up on the second floor, all 14 gauge. This is the supply wire coming in from the panel. This is actually a 12-2 wire also. This was brand new. I took it right off of the roll. This would predate 2001, I believe. That goes up into the outlet. I pigtailed them together up in there, and then I brought this yellow one back down, and this goes over to a counter outlet for, you know, in my kitchen. This makes up one circuit in my kitchen. This is one 20 amp circuit. The kitchen's not that big in this house. And this is, of course, the second 20 amp circuit, and this follows back along here. And it comes up into here. Let me grab, I have a small light here. Of course, I have a temporary light up over this desk. So that wire comes back along that beam and comes up into here, into this junction box. And this is for the second kitchen receptacle circuit. Now, this does power one outlet that is in the same wall that's in the head into my living room. That's right there. It was just convenient to hook it there. There's only a lamp hooked to that outlet anyways, but this one right here we're looking at actually goes to the GFI outlet that's in the kitchen, that's at the head end of that circuit. And then there's a crossover in the wall up there to the next outlet, and then this one comes back down. This is a return from the GFI, and these two here that power the other two kitchen outlets are actually hooked on to that GFI circuit also right inside the box here. As you can see, I got a switch leg for my furnace that runs along here. And there's an example of one of those old 1950s cloth covered cables. This goes to a vanity light in the kitchen, just one single light fixture, and it goes over into that box right there. Now this is where you see the variety of different wiring. This cable right here is black, but is a 14-2. I think you can see it right there. 14-2 with a ground. Type NM. That is a Paranite Paraflex cable. That's probably from the early 1970s. Because it has 14 gauge conductors in it, and it also has a 14 gauge ground. I had no issues with using that. I'll even show you this. I loosened these screws in this cover so I could. There's how I made my boxes up. As you can see, this cloth wire that's coming down into here actually has the PVC coated wires on it. So it's fine. I mean, There's no ground to that light fixture, but I can deal with that, I guess. I'm not, you know, once again, I did this not mainly to bring this place necessarily 100% to code. I brought it, you know, I did this to prevent electrical fires. You know, that old wiring that was in this place was just garbage. Now on this convenience outlet, this circuit goes over to the water pump. And then I have another convenience outlet that goes upstairs into my bathroom. The first floor bathroom. I just did it because it was convenient. This is a 15 amp lighting circuit right here. As you can see, there's a 12 gauge wire coming down. That actually goes up to the switch box for my hall light and my living room light. I don't remember what the deal was. This was one of the very first projects that I did here when I was rewiring, and I believe I ran out of 14 gauge wire that day, and I had to run that. It's like 4 feet of wire there that goes up into that switch box. Now everything from there to the light fixtures is 14 gauge, so I actually wrote right on that wire with a marker that is to be 15 amp circuit. I think my original intention was to change it out, but it never happened. As you can see here, these come out of that switch box up there. There's two 14-3 cables here. There's three-way lighting switches. One for the living room light, one for the hallway light. So coming across here, yeah, there was even more splices over here that I'll get a picture up here too. I'll pause for just a minute here so you can look at the picture. Okay, so these wires here go into the north end of my living room. There's one here and one there. This is a feeder from the panel. These were spliced onto the knob and tube wire. I'll take this off. I'll show you how I made this up. That's how I made it up. You know, I'm not a professional, but I try as hard as I can to do things right. There is a ground screw in there behind that top cable. It's screwed into the box and all the wires are bonded to it. So, of course you can see here, there's 3 circuits now running onto this beam just from here. There's 2 kitchen lighting circuits for a total of 5 that replace that one. Also, over on the other side of the furnace over there, we haven't got to go over there, but I also ran a dedicated circuit for the upstairs lighting up through the dining room wall. So I pulled another 15 amp circuit up through. So anyways, as you can tell, even though some people might not like this, I mean, there is a little bit of a variety of wire, different types of wire here, but I did ensure that I gauged everything appropriately. You know, I put the right breaker 15 amp breakers for lighting circuits and 20 amp for outlet circuits, or anything that I have that's powered with a 12 gauge cable mostly. I think there is a 15 amp breaker on that water pump over there, but you know, that's plenty. This is a far cry from what this was originally, as you can tell. It's so much safer. I'll show you this. I'm sorry that I'm kind of moving around here some. There's a little bit of water down here in the cellar. It's been raining like a monsoon here for 2 days. This is my oil-fired hot water heater. I put together a nice new circuit here to run this. This is the power in from the panel. That's the switch leg that goes upstairs at the top to the top of the cellar stairs, and I put that piece of armored cable together. Did the same thing for my furnace. I also put a dedicated generator circuit in here to power my furnace and a few lighting fixtures. It's not tied together with my panel in any way. I'll take you over and just give you a little glance at this. So let me turn this light bulb in here so we can see. I brought this cable in from the back of the house. It's a 10-3 cable. I got a 4,000 watt generator that's pretty small, so I didn't really want to try to power the whole house, so I just put a couple of dedicated circuits. And as you can see, we have another Westinghouse safety switch that's identical to the one that's over there on that table. It's all rusted. I do use this for the generator circuit. This is not tied to the panel in any way. In fact, you know, this is all dead. I can reach in here and touch everything. The generator's in the garage and it's unhooked from it. So all I did with this, there's a receptacle over there by my furnace. I can unplug the furnace from one receptacle and plug it into the generator receptacle. Of course, you can see there's a bulb fixture here that's marked generator only. There's another one over by the furnace. There's another one up at the top of the stairs. And the only other thing that I did, I put a receptacle up at the top of the cellar stairs here, so I can just run an extension cord out into the living room, you know, run lamps or whatever. You know, I've only had to use this a couple of times. I put it up here, I don't know, over a year ago. I've used it twice, I think. We had a pretty bad power failure here back earlier in the winter. We was without power for 3 or 4 hours here one day in the winter time, and it was pretty cold, so I put the generator on and run the furnace. And back, I don't know, sometime last fall, just when we were starting to get into the heating system, they decided to do substation maintenance downtown, and they disconnected the power for most of the night. So I ran the generator that night too, just to keep the furnace going, keep the house warm. The generator I have will run for about 8 hours on 1 tank of gas, so it's funny how this fuse box right here was installed originally in this house. This used to power my hot water heater, the old electric hot water heater that used to be here, and it's pretty amazing the difference in the condition between this one and the one that's over there on the table that come out of my grandparents' house that had a rock wall foundation with dirt floor in it. It's amazing the difference in the humidity. This basement here is pretty dry most of the time, but of course it's got some water here tonight creeping in under the wall. But anyways, I guess that I could pretty much cut you guys off there. I hope that I hope that this was some valuable information for people. But anyways, have a good evening. It's great to be back on here again. I haven't made any YouTube videos for quite a while. Have a good evening. Bye.